Relations between Venezuela and US have become strained, especially after the collapse of the Venezuelan economy and the alleged coup d'etat. While for now there doesn't seem to be an immediate threat of US military intervention in Venezuela, this video explores what would such military action look like. Before our video starts, a very short heads up. Our Binkov branded t-shirts and other products are now on a limited time sale, including our Binkov Wants You line of products. For the next 10 days, you'll get a 20% discount if you use the promotional code Binkov over at our store at Teespring. The link is also available below in the video description. Check them out. And now the video continues. US armed forces are of course many times larger. The question thus isn't can the US do it, but how would the US go about it and what are the minimal but realistic forces US would need. Venezuela is a medium-sized country. It sits at the north of South America and it isn't that far away from the US. US has various military detachments in countries nearby, including Colombia. But let's say US doesn't get a green light to use those countries as a springboard. Most likely staging areas would then include the US naval base in Cuba at Guantanamo. That base is on a decades-old piece of land that's been leased and in the meantime taken from Cuba. And the various facilities in Puerto Rico, as Puerto Rico is US territory, only not incorporated as a US state. Some 60% of its population expressed desire to become a US state. Between those two, US would have some decent staging areas in aerial strike range. US has 6 carriers homeported on its eastern coast, as well as 3 of its amphibious assault-ready groups. Such a major war against Venezuela would probably involve fleets from both east and west coast, but the western-based ones would take longer to deploy. Several carriers are surge-ready and would be able to ship out in anywhere between a week and a month. 2 more carriers, if US wants to wait that long, would likely be ready within 3 more months. Adding in the considerable land-based planes in Puerto Rico and some in Cuba, as well as even some bombers and potentially even long-range strike jets such as F-15s being refueled in air and based in mainland US, the American force may very well number over 500 combat planes. And almost all of those would be 5th or 4th generation planes, with technology dating from 2000s onwards. Venezuelan Air Force is much more modest. They fly and train a fair deal, but their numbers and technology levels are simply not comparable. Venezuelan Air Force has been modernized some 10 years ago with Russian-made flankers, but they weren't top-of-the-line flanker models even back then, and the old remaining F-16s are basically early 1980s tech, unable to do long-range air combat. Back before its economic crisis, Venezuela also modernized its air defenses, which are relatively potent but not very numerous. US would have a considerable fleet of electronic emission detection planes operating from afar, as well as unmanned aircraft operating trying to pinpoint the location of moving sand batteries. The modern fighter jets such as F-22 and F-35 have precise electronic emission geolocation systems, enabling them to hunt for radars on their own. While US is bound to suffer some casualties, possibly including even some stealth planes, overall losses would be rather minimal. US cruise missile barrage would likely prevent Venezuela from getting most of its air force in the air. Within days of the start of US attack, most of Venezuelan air force would be neutralized, and within weeks, depending on how much they're used actively and how much they're being moved around, most of Venezuelan air defenses would also be neutralized. Light attack planes that Venezuela has may operate from unprepared bases, but they're fairly inconsequential. US would soon be in position to keep striking at Venezuelan army and navy bases, which would likely result in dispersal of those assets. While the army could move out, the navy ships would eventually get caught, or would simply be left without supplies. The airstrikes would soon thereafter spread to various industrial points and secondary government targets. Anything really to destabilize the government in charge. The hope being that with a collapsing working state and an army forced to disperse, the population would rise up and a civil war would start. As an added pressure, US may even take some of the islands north of Venezuela. They're sufficiently far away from Venezuelan mainland, so US forces there would be fairly safe, yet close enough that helicopters could easily operate from them. Various amphibious assault options would also open, with ships needing short reload cycles between delivering troops on the beachheads. Of course, using those islands also requires some weeks of actually making facilities on them. Venezuela could try to reinforce the islands with thousands of troops, but lack of facilities cuts both ways. And US could simply choose to blockade the islands and make the soldiers run out of supplies. If bent on taking them, US might suffer perhaps hundreds of casualties. It's far from sure US would need to go down that route. Eventually though, if regime doesn't fall and if a land invasion is still on the table, some proper landings would have to be performed. Of course, in the real world, the question of whether US would risk any sort of a ground invasion would likely get a negative answer. Instead, airstrikes and maybe even CIA-sponsored acts in hopes of population overthrowing the current government might take place. Pursuing the land invasion option thus signals us entering fantasy territory, but let's explore it anyway. Assuming Venezuelan forces would not be half ravaged by a civil war, there would be many soldiers Venezuela could throw at US. Its active army seems fairly small compared to the likes of Iraqi one, but there are many additional army formations to aid it. Most of the army is conscripted, with the service term being whopping 2.5 years. But not accounted for there is the Venezuelan militia. It's a paramilitary force that has been expanding in recent years, mostly as means of Venezuelan government securing their place. It's a light infantry force that's tasked with upkeeping the internal peace, basically an anti-coup d'etat force, and on paper it's vast. Exact figures are hard to verify. Years ago it was a 200,000 strong force, but then it allegedly grew to 500,000 and recently Venezuelan government proclaimed it's over 1 million strong. Of course, it could very well be that those are just numbers thrown out there. For sure, such a huge number of people assembled in such a time frame can't be an effective trained force. It's more likely an assembly of people on paper, with only a small part of them with some experience and personal weapons. Some analysts throw around figures of 15 to 100,000 actual armed militiamen at any one time. But assuming enough political support, Venezuela could mobilize potentially a few million of its residents into light infantry units, be them activated militiamen or army units. Though it's not realistic 10% of the population would willingly serve. 1 million or 2 seems more plausible. When it comes to actual army and its inventory, it's not considerable, and the inventory is fairly old. Some of those would be destroyed from the air. In case of a civil war, some of them would be lost to the insurgents. The numbers of various other armored vehicles shows Venezuela doesn't really intend to fight a classical war. Majority of its army is not mechanized, but uses fairly simple unarmored trucks and jeeps. Venezuelan army is also fairly light on fire support for its size, though it does have a dozen Smerch rocket systems with a decent reach of 90 kilometers. Its 10 attack helicopters are again more a force against insurgents than something to go against the US. Americans would likely deploy a few hundred attack helicopters from those islands to support an invasion. Interestingly though, one area where Venezuela is unusually well equipped for its size is shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles. Venezuela bought thousands of them in the last 20 years. Since insurgents don't really fly planes, that manpad inventory is geared against a large invading force, like the US one. Those shoulder-launched missiles can't reach even medium altitudes, but they can very much threaten helicopters. And most of those are fairly modern Igla manpads. It is quite possible if US would press on with an invasion, which not only needs to land troops but needs air support over the nearby jungles, that literally tens of helicopters might be lost per day. That's not just attack helicopters, but mostly various transport choppers bringing in supplies and reinforcements to US troops. Indeed, the jungles and lack of infrastructure make helicopters the way of moving supplies when inland, which is why Venezuela has quite a few of transport helicopters of its own. The geography of Venezuelan coastline isn't very forthcoming either. Some parts are flat, but there's also jungles and mountains. US could, for example, concentrate eastwards, but Cordillera de Merida mountains could eventually stop even a mighty US war machine, especially if populated by hundreds of thousands of militiamen. US advantage in motorization, technology and heavy firepower would mean little in mountainous or jungle-like terrain. Perhaps the quickest way of supporting a civil war would be to make the government centers fall, but going for the capital of Caracas would be a tall order. Not only is it behind a mountain chain, but it's a sprawling metropolis. The rough terrain, urban centers, and a country more populous than Iraq was in '91 would likely lead to tens of thousands of US casualties, perhaps even more, depending on morale. US could try to go around and not hit the beaches but use air assaults. After all, most of Venezuela is not very densely populated, but such approach, while easy on the initial casualties, would mean tens of thousands of US troops basically in the middle of nowhere, having to traverse hundreds of kilometers of jungle. The northern part of the country would be crucial, and heavy equipment could only be brought in numbers by sea. While Venezuela doesn't have a lot of tanks and other systems, its topography is suited for anti-tank missile hit-and-run tactics. Venezuela does have a lot of troops on paper, but its force isn't very mobile. The paramilitaries are slow formations and wouldn't react quickly, especially since Venezuela doesn't have the early warning assets pinpointing the location of US landings. With the long coastline, US would likely achieve local numerical superiority if they settled to land a bit away from the population centers. And in the weeks after the initial landing, regular US Army troops would be brought in. Not counting the badly trained Venezuelan militia, US would have more troops in play. Trouble would be getting those large formations to and through urban centers without lots of casualties. It really comes down to support of Venezuelan populace. A decade of economic crisis and harsh living took their toll. Polls made after the last election suggest most of the population does not support the government. If a civil war really broke out, some of that population might uprise, which is precisely why the militia force grew several-fold in the last few years. The neighboring countries such as Colombia and Brazil did not recognize the election results and would likely help upkeep an arms embargo. US could probably invade if this was a game world where human lives didn't matter, but it might be another Vietnam for the US. And tens of thousands or more of US troops might die or get wounded. Or the country could dissolve and a civil war could quickly spread, with possibly hundreds of thousands dead by the time peace breaks out and a steady government, likely US supported, rises up. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.